Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. Our university and our department are very proud to host this Easter School, which, as you know, is organized within the framework of the SA Beyond Borders Erasmus project, which involves 5 European universities: Malta, which is the leading institution, then Ghent, Groningen, which I will, as I said, I will never learn how to pronounce properly, Groningen, Ljubljana, and Pisa. Since the beginning of the project, we've been working together, and we've given birth to several activities about and around the essay as a genre. But the most important mission of this project has been the teaching of the essay, with the intention to, so to say, disseminate knowledge and practice of the genre. I'm now leaving the floor to Professor Alessandro Lenci, head of the Department of Philology, Literature and Linguistics, who will extend the department's greetings and welcome on behalf of all our colleagues. Thank you, Alessandro, for being here.
Thanks, Roberta. I'm very glad here to represent the Department of Philology, Literature and Linguistics to welcome you in Pisa, welcome this project, and welcome this beautiful event. Well, it's a great pleasure for us to host an event with the title which seems to be so much out of date and so much up to date. In the sense that in a era in which we have machines that write essays, it seems almost out of date to think about what is the science and let's say craftsmanship of writing essays. On the other hand, it's just because of this that it's so up to date, teaching and perfecting and improving and let's say investigating the art and craft of essay writing. And that's why I found this theme so fascinating and so in line also with, let's say, some of the core activities of our department. In our department, there is a project sponsored by the Italian Ministry of Research, which is called CECIL, and which is excellent centers for the fighting language impoverishment. And one of the, let's say, the missions of this project is exactly to improve the language, the writing and understanding skills of young generations, university students, because we are in a moment in which we think that university today doesn't do enough in its normal curriculum in order to focus on this specific, let's say, attitude, ability, which is exactly, on the one hand, nowadays empowered and, let's say, projected by technologies. On the other hand, is exactly put in danger as an ability by this technology itself. So I think it's a really very nice project. Thanks for the Erasmus project and to Roberta and Paolo Bugliani for bringing it here. So it's my pleasure to welcome you again in our town and enjoy this period, this study, enjoy the weather, and enjoy our beautiful city. Thanks again.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you very much. And food, of course. The principal investigator and the deus ex machina of this project is Professor Mario Aquilina from Malta University. So, Mario, please.
Thank you, Roberta. Don't want to say too much, because if you're here, you already know about the project. I first of all want to begin by thanking my colleagues, so Roberta, Ferrari, and Paolo Bugliani especially, but also Professor Lenci and the Department of Philology, Literature and Linguistics at Pisa. Their hosting is exceptional. People who know me from Malta know that I'm organized, but with Roberta and Paolo, I feel very relieved that when I wake up at night and think, did we do that? Very often I ask, yes, it's done. So for me, that was brilliant. Now, of course, the project also involves other partners who are all here. There's Professor Adrian Grima, who is my colleague, of course, from the Department of Maltese in his case. I remember us talking in the corridor 4 or 5 years ago about this idea. And from there, you led me to Andrej Blatnik from Slovene Writers Association. And then I started asking people who I was connected to with DSA, and I found Paolo Bugliani, who then introduced me to Roberta. Jasper Del Becke, who's going to be presenting later on in the conference, introduced us to Jürgen, and I think Jürgen introduced us to Thijs, if I'm not mistaken. So that's how all this was formed, and it's a fantastic group of people who have managed to bring you here, so I'm grateful for them to have done that. One of the nice things about this event, but also about the events that I have been involved in this project so far, is the mix of people. So I gave workshops in Malta where I had published writers, full professors, but also aspiring writers, students, and we have a mixed demographic again here, which to me is a great strength, okay? Because there are mixed experiences which can allow us to learn a lot. The aim of the Easter School is to give us the opportunity to think, to read, to write, to discuss essayistically. So it's not just about writing, but it's also about thinking in certain ways. We've got what I hope is a good program for you. We encourage you to mix and to get to know each other and to participate actively in all the sessions. We hope to establish an atmosphere where you can all work and feel that you can contribute. So that's all I wanted to say. Don't want to keep it too long. We're looking forward to begin. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Mario. And thank you for leading us through this adventure. The program of these 4 days, these Pisan days, is particularly rich, and I think it testifies to a lively and steadily increasing interest in the essay, in its study and its writing. And I'm sure it will be a thought-provoking school and conference, an important moment of confrontation and discussion. And I also hope that Pisa will be able to welcome you warmly and show you her best looks. Poet Percy Shelley once said that nothing could surpass a sunset in Pisa. And though Byron disagreed, because he preferred Venetian sunsets, I hope that you will be able to enjoy some glimpses of this beauty during your stay. So welcome to Pisa, welcome to the Easter School and the conference, and enjoy everything. Thank you.
So for the first time in history of conferences, we're ahead of schedule, 10 minutes, which is I can't promise that we'll continue being ahead of schedule, but we are, so we might as well begin. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so as you can see, okay, I was told to speak here. The reason why I'm speaking here, not because I can't project my voice. So I come from a village in Malta called Zurri, and in Malta they say if you come from a village, you can project your voice because you're brought up living in the streets, or you used to. You can't do that anymore. They'll run you over, so many cars. But I have to use the microphones because we're also recording the sessions, and we're going to be disseminating some of the material. Okay, it's part of the deliverables of the project, so that's why we're all going to have to speak through the microphone when we're presenting. So, as you can see from your program, the first session is going to be co-delivered by Professor Thijs Lijster and me. And the aim of the session is to provide a conceptual framework, like a kind of ways of thinking about what we're going to be doing, right? So I'm going to go first, and then Thijs is going to come in after me, and then we're going to have, towards the end of the session, a good half an hour of group discussion and also wider discussion among all of us. So The task that I have been given is to talk about what the essay is. What is an essay? Essentially, what we're trying to do today is to answer, I would say, 2 questions. What is an essay, and then why the essay? Thijs will focus more on that why. And I'm going to begin with the what. Now, it seems like a very simple question. And I should know how to answer it, right? Because if I've been working on the essay for a few years, and I've written a few things about the essay, that I should be able to define it. And yet, to me, that is the most difficult question you can ask me. And the more I read, the harder it becomes for me to answer that question. So what I will do instead is not tell you what the essay is, but ways of thinking about it. Okay? And I'm going to provide quite a few. So how does one manage, in my defense, right, to provide a definition of the essay that would allow us to include within it so many different essayists? Now, the ones I mentioned here are just a few of them: Montaigne and John Locke. Right? So someone who is working constantly digressively and through association, and someone who uses method as a philosophical approach. How do we bring in Francis Bacon, who never really speaks about himself, and William Hazlitt, who sometimes embarrasses himself with some of the things that he writes in his own essays? How do we bring in together the formality and the classical disposition of someone like Alexander Pope and the sentimentality or tone of someone like Charles Lamb? And you can go on and on. So the reason why the essay is difficult to define is that there are many different kinds of essays and many different kinds of essayists. And here I have limited myself to just the English language tradition. And I'm looking forward in this Easter school to also be introduced to other essayists from the traditions you're familiar with. Okay? And of course, different lecturers will bring in different ideas. So that's one of the reasons why this is a problem. So how could we start thinking of doing it? One repetitive move that, and I am guilty of having used it a number of times, of people writing about the essay, first of all, they feel the need to start with a definition or problems of a definition. That is recurrent. So if you go into a lot of books on the essay, they start by doing what I've just done. Sort of saying, I'm going to have to define the essay, and yet the essay is difficult to define. Well, and one of the things that they will then do next is to go to etymology. Right? So that's one move. What does the word essay mean, or what has it meant? And they will do that. Okay? Here I give you an excerpt from something that I had tried to do myself. And this kind of move would then do the following. So if we trace the etymology of the word essay, we might go as far back to the Latin origins of the term exegium, which means to weigh or to weight. Right? Weighing, the idea of weighing. Now, be attentive to these metaphors. You will see that there are multiple metaphors of how to talk about what the essay is and what to essay means. One of them is weighing. That's where we often go to. And then that leads, in later Romance languages, to the idea of to try or to attempt, as in French, essayer, or to try, or essay. Now, those who are already a little bit familiar with the history of the essay will know that Michel de Montaigne, right, towards the end of the 16th century, will call a number of texts that he has written essays. So what he does is he takes the verb, essay, and turns it into the name of a genre. And he calls them, so we move now from the idea of trying to the idea of a genre, which is essayistic. But then this continues even after Montaigne, and others will continue playing with the etymology of the term. So, for example, André Belot tells us the Latin verb exigere, from which the French essay derives, had a secondary meaning to a, which is to hunt or chase out of a place. And from there, we get, he says, essaim, swarm, this idea of a swarm of ideas. Okay, so this is another metaphor. We already have weighing, we have trying, we have attempting, we also have swarm as an idea. And in fact, it's something that we will return to. The essay as an accumulation of things. So that's the etymology route of trying to define it. There are other routes. One thing which we have to say, or we might say, is that we could call, or we could define the essay by pointing out which of the texts have been described as essays. So an essay is what has been described, an essay. Now, that move will always be selective, right? So one of the things, for instance, that you will notice, and that is quite straightforward, is that for many of us, at least in my case, this is the case, when I hear the word essay, well, for a number of years in my life, I would associate essay to what I would write as homework in language lessons, right? There's a beautiful essay. Is Kurt here? Kurt Borch? I can't see. There's a beautiful essay. No, he'll come later. Because he shared with me an essay by Zadie Smith, published recently in The New Yorker, called The Art of the Impersonal Essay, in which he talks precisely about this. That very often, most of us are introduced to the essay academically in schools. And we're not really talking too much about that, but that is also important. So one way to think about what the essay is would be to look at that process of canonization and selection of the essay. So here you have the way in which anthologists, editors, and I would say that this is something that really accelerated in the early 1990s and later, have gathered essays from literary tradition and put them together for us. On the left, you've got one of the most canonical collections of the essay, The Art of the Personal Essay. I just mentioned Zadie Smith. The Art of the Impersonal Essay is, although she does not mention Lopate, is an allusion to that anthology, right? And you've got others, the English essayists. Now, there, you've also got books which might make some essay scholars angry. They don't make me angry, but they might make some essay scholars angry, and I'm referring to the books by John D'Agata. And the reason is that John D'Agata looks at the essay even before Montaigne, and tells us that the essay does not start with Montaigne, but can be found also, for example, in Seneca, in Plutarch. Why does this make some scholars angry? Because some are obsessed with the idea of the essay having to be of a particular kind, right? It has to be written in a certain way. So, essentially, again, this is not an answer to what the essay is, but an indication of the issues involved, right? So there is the issue of canonization, which essays should we read, but there is disagreement among these anthologists about what should go in these particular works. Now, the direction I'm going to take is not the etymological one, is not the one where I look at the history of the essay. What I'm going to do is to try to give different entry points. So different ways of thinking about the essay, the essayistic. And to do that, I called what follows. So I wanted to give myself a task. I wanted to give myself a test, right? And I said, can you think of 13 ways of looking at the essay. So this was my task. So in a way, this was a little bit of an essayistic thing to do, right? And I was trying to discover, as I was preparing this presentation, whether I could get to 13, or how maybe I could organize these different ways of thinking about the essay. And the way I'm going to do it, and the way I did it, was through the conversational element, which is central to the essay. So I'm going to quote a lot of people. So what I want to do next is not tell you what the essay is, because frankly, I cannot answer that question in a way which feels comprehensive. But I'm going to provide 13 ways of looking at the essay. Now, this is very much the spirit of what we're going to be doing in the Easter School, whether it's in the workshops, whether it's in the lectures or in the discussion. We're not here to teach you how to write essays, also because some of you are published authors who have published essays, right? But we're going to try to explore different possibilities. So what comes next is not determined by a specific order. At least I did not intend it to. So what comes first is not necessarily more important than what comes second, or less important than what comes second. I'm not even sure that there's a logic to the connection between the different parts, and yet there might be some motifs which will arise as I look at these different ways. So the first one, of course, is the idea of the essay as a trial. And let's quote Montaigne for this one. So Montaigne writes in Of Repentance. So Montaigne wrote a few more than 100 essays. I think around 34 of them, if I remember correctly, theorize the essay. They tell us what the essay is. So they are not only essays, but they tell us what to essay means. And Of Repentance is one of them. Incidentally, this meta-awareness, the essayist being aware that they are writing an essay, is very much a recurrent characteristic of the essay tradition. Beautifully captured in the book by Klaus and French, Essayists on the Essay, which brings together more than 100 essayists trying to define it. So the first one is the essay is a trial. If my mind could gain a firm footing, Montaigne writes, I would not make essays, I would make decisions, but it is always in apprenticeship and on trial. Okay? So this idea of an experiment of thought, that's one way in which we could think about this. Initially this idea was seen pejoratively. So when Samuel Johnson, in his dictionary, the 18th century English critic and a very important English critic, writes that the essay is a loose sally of the mind, he means it quite pejoratively. Originally, the essay is seen as something quite amateurish, incomplete. And that idea of writing something experimentally in certain historical context is not necessarily celebrated. It becomes celebrated, of course, in moments like Romanticism or Modernism, and perhaps even in our time. That's one definition, to think of the essay as an experiment, a trial. Second take, the essay as knowledge derived somehow from experience. One of the things that Montaigne does, which he considers to be revolutionary, and one of the reasons why, for example, Jacques Rancière describes Montaigne as one of the first moderns, right? Even though Montaigne is writing at the end of the 16th century, is that Montaigne starts challenging the classical idea that knowledge is primarily inherited and therefore something that you internalize and maybe combine to something that ultimately has to be confronted by individual experience. This is one of the modern things that Montaigne does, and that Shakespeare does, contemporaries ultimately. So again, Michel de Montaigne in his essay now of experience. There is no desire more natural than that of knowledge. We attempt all means that may bring us into it. When reason fails us, we employ experience. And then later, I could have chosen quite a few. Walter Pater, from Plato and Platonism, the essay is the appropriate form for a mind for which truth itself is but a possibility, realizable not as general conclusion, but rather as the elusive effect of a particular personal experience. Now, we will see this over and over again. Think, for example, of the essays of George Orwell, right? Think of even more contemporary essays where the idea is that the personal is political. Essays are often driven by this idea that knowledge has to be somehow confronted with or arises from the individual experience. Third take. The essay now as a movement of thought. So, as you can see, these different takes move between thinking of the form of the essay to thinking about the process of the essay, the origins of the essay. We'll also look at the audience of the essay. This one is one of my favorites. The essay being a way of thinking, and a particular way in which thought moves. Movement and the essay go hand in hand. Hence, the many essays about walking, for example. William Hazlitt's on Going a Journey, for instance, or, of course, Virginia Woolf, Street Haunting, for instance, which I'm sure will be mentioned later. So the essay as a movement of thought is a third way of thinking about it. Much of the pleasure in writing an essay, and when the writing is any good, the pleasure in reading it, comes from this dodging and leaping, this movement of the mind, says Scott Russell Sanders in the well-known essay, The Singular First Person. William Gass, the hero of the essay is its author in the act of thinking things out, feeling and finding a way. It is the mind in the marvels and miseries of its makings, in the work of the imagination, the search for form. You will find these words repeatedly: the search, the quest, the movement, the journey. The essay often presents itself as process rather than as product, even though, of course, at some point it becomes a product too. But it does emphasize this idea of movement, which can take the shape of digressions. In fact, my workshop tomorrow is precisely about this. This is what we're going to be working on, ways of moving in the essay. Fourth one, we can think of the essay as the gathering of affinities. Affinities is the name of a recent collection by Brian Dillon. The quotation here is not from his collection Affinities, which is a more recent one, but his quite well-known 2017 book Essayism on Form, Feeling, and Fiction. The idea of the essay is a gathering of things which you have affinities with, but also that have affinities with each other. So the essayist as a gatherer of pieces. I like the idea of the essay as a kind of conglomerate, an aggregate, either of diverse materials or disparate ways of saying the same or similar things. Walter Benjamin on constellations, we could use maybe that metaphor, the constellation metaphor. Or maybe you could think of Roland Barthes and his use of the fragmentary and of quotations. These are names we will come back to. So again, this is one of my favorites. The essay is a gathering of affinities. The essay as conversation. So now the focus is more on a kind of disposition towards someone, right, as opposed to how it's written. The focus shifts a little bit to voice. What is the voice? What is the tone of the essay? And the idea of the essay as conversation is there. And from the very beginning, because Michel de Montaigne and his friend, Émile de Berthy, with whom he shared intimate thoughts, dies, and Montaigne needs, he tells us in his essay of Friendship, another person or another with whom to converse. So the essay in that case is born from the need to replace this human-to-human conversation. And that idea recurs. I would say it's there before Montaigne. I often in my classes like to go to Seneca. Montaigne tells us what I'm doing, Seneca has done. Francis Bacon, who is the first in the English tradition, tells us what I'm doing. He doesn't tell us anything about Montaigne. He takes us to Seneca and Plutarch. And Seneca, and you go to the letters, the epistles to Lucilius, are conversations with Lucilius. And to me, the origins of the essays can be found there. The essay is conversation. So I have two quotations here. Emerson, I know not anywhere the book that seems written less. It is the language of conversation transferred to a book. Cut these words and they would bleed. They are vascular and alive. So presence and voice are often associated to the idea of the essay. And then David Shields, more recently, in an interview in the Edinburgh Companion to the essay, basically the thing that I love about the essayistic gesture is that there's this unbelievably intimate connection between the speaker and the audience, the extraordinary intimacy and the amazing conversation that develops between a truly rigorously honest essayist and a truly empathetic reader. Now, of course, people who are trained into literary theory, etc., will start saying, okay, we're going to question presence, we're going to question voice, we're going to question honesty, we're going to question sincerity. And we could do that, but these are the things that the essay tells us about itself. Now, whether we're skeptical about that or not, right, whether we believe that someone can speak in one's own voice in writing or not, these are the recurrent things that the essay wants us to hear. Okay? The essay is voice. A personal essay, writes Edward Hoagland, is the human voice talking, its order, the mind's natural flow, instead of a systematized outline of ideas. Or Cynthia Ozick, above all, the essay is not a hidden principle, or a thesis, or a construct. She is there, a living voice. She takes us in. Now, this idea, therefore, of a voice which brings coherence as opposed to an argument which is coherent in itself is something that others will contradict and that we'll come back to later, but it's a recurrent idea. What brings coherence and order is the presence of the essayist as opposed to the stability of the argument, so to speak. The essay beyond the borders of genre, that's another way of thinking about it. The genre perspective. So you could go to Reda Ben-Smaya, whose book, The Bard's Effect, the essay's reflective text, is one of my favorites because it brings together what I was trained with, so Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida, to the tradition of the essay. To be fair, Ben-Smaya takes Barthes as exemplary of the essay, and therefore his theory of the essay is very French and post-structuralist. But I really like this insight that the essay is ageneric or anti-genre. Now, this, to me, reveals a paradox, which we'll come back to later. Or else Rachel Blau Duplessis, again, that essay is highly recommended, F Words, an essay on the essay. The nature of the essay asks one to resist categories, starting with itself. Gender, genre. David Lazar explores that affinity in an essay called Queering the Essay. The essay is the queer genre because it is a category difficult or impossible to characterize by normative standards. So you've got this idea of the essay being, first of all, a mixture, or even more than a mixture, a resistance to the idea of genre, with the suggestion that this also brings in the non-normative dimension of the essay. It's resistance to categorization. So one can speak about, I don't know, in very simple terms, of the many essays or essayistic works which literally combine genre. For example, memoir and the essay, or like travel writing and the essay, Sebald, for example, or autobiography and the essayistic, Roland Barthes, or Joan Didion, reportage and the essayistic, The White Album, for instance, or the novel and the essay, Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, or Claudia Rankine's Citizen, An American Lyric, which is sometimes put in the poetry section in bookshops, sometimes put in the essay section in bookshops, but yeah, could be seen as quite a few different genres. Okay, origins. Where does the essay come from? The essay is occasional. It responds to something. Hence the title, On. So if you were to look at the most typical kinds of titles, you will see that it is on something or off something. So the idea that the essay is a response. Usually the performance is something occurs and the essayist reacts, right? It could be something that one looks for. So for example, I don't know, E.B. White goes once more to the lake. That is a sought experience. Or it could be a found experience. Virginia Woolf, Death of the Moth. Didn't look for the moth, it appeared. The essay is a response to it. So the occasional aspect of the essay. It is born from an occasion, a response to an object. Erin Plunkett has a good chapter on this, writes, the essay begins with something, it is occasional, it is about something, it always speaks of something that has already been given form, or at least something that has already been there at some time in the past. Now as we progress, and we get closer to the end of this, notice the differences. Compare this to number 2, the essay is experience, the focus is the experience, now the focus is the object. And somehow, these different possibilities stand next to each other. It is at the same time possible to think of the essay as stemming from experience and as stemming from the object that one reacts to. The essay as a textile of quotations. So we have had a number of slides speaking about the way the essay comes from the personal, comes from experience. It is expressive, it's voice. And yet we find over and over again that in actual fact, most essayists quote all the time. We have one workshop, in fact, Jürgen and Luna, which is going to be about citations and quotations. You go to Seneca and he's quoting. You go to Montaigne, he's constantly quoting. You go to many essays, they are constantly in conversation with others through these different quotations. The essay convokes a community of writers, then it uses any and each and all of them like instruments in an orchestra. It both composes and conducts. One example of this would be William Hazlitt, who's constantly quoting Shakespeare, or misquoting Shakespeare most of the time. Because the quotation is not just to bring in other authorities, but also to confront one's own thoughts with others. And that might also mean misquoting others as you form your own thought. The essay as heresy, one of the most well-known, of course. I'm sure we'll hear Adorno's name repeatedly. The law of the innermost form of the essay, Adorno writes, is heresy. Connect that to the non-normative idea which we mentioned in relation to genre, or the mix of genres. By transgressing the orthodox of thought, something becomes visible in the object, which it is orthodoxy's secret purpose to keep invisible. Adorno's thinking is very useful for us to understand the essay as a way of thinking rather than a kind of written form. Right? He's thinking of the essay as something which does not begin from the established modes of thought, but dares to challenge that. And because of that, it doesn't quite know where it's going, right? And it resists that end-orientedness that other kinds of thinking might give us. Or Adam Phillips, writing essays and the literary essay as a form is an act of resistance, a protest, a refusal to meet certain criteria. So, essaying as resistance. And yet there is also a tradition of the essay as being persuasive. So you've got people like Cynthia Ozick saying the essay is non-polemical. And then you've got a lot of other essays to speak about the essay as amateurish in the sense of being about something you love, but not to be taken too seriously, a loose study of the mind, table talk, conversation, whatever. But then you have the actual essay used polemically and also to try to make a direct intervention in the world. So if you follow the tradition of the political essay now, okay, and that is particularly strong in the American tradition, but not just, okay, then the essay is also argumentative. So Rebecca Solnit, for example, essays are inherently political. Because if the piece doesn't reach some conclusion, then it isn't an essay. This definition that Rebecca Solnit gives, completely opposite to the ways in which we often tend to define the essay, is inconclusive. And yet, it makes a claim to the essay through someone who has published hundreds of essays. And therefore, there is also this stake, the essay as an argument. Giroux, having persuasion for its object, the essay states a proposition. The essay's process. I do not portray being, Montaigne famously writes, I portray passing. Not the passing from one age to another, like the 7 ages of man, right? But from day to day, from minute to minute. I am constantly changing, so what I can portray is change. Or Adorno, the form is characterized by its groping intention, and the essay becomes true in its progress, which derives it beyond itself. Last slide, to me, and that's where I'm really it's my entry point into the essay. To me, all of this presents a kind of contradiction, kind of paradox, and I'm fascinated by paradoxes and by things which are difficult to resolve. Because if we believe a lot of the things that I've just been telling you about the essay, then the essay would be most essayistic when it is less obviously recognizable as an essay. If the essay is that which pushes against the borders of what is known, of what is already done, it is in this moment of transgression that is somehow, it is recuperated into an essay. How do you resolve that tension? I do not know. But Thijs will hopefully answer why this is important. So let's start.
Thank you, Mario, for that great introduction. Yes, welcome everyone. Great to be here. As Mario already announced, while he was talking about the what of the essay, I'm going to continue in his path and talk a little bit about the why of the essay. And you could say that next to the what and the why, there's also the how. I guess for the rest of this Easter school is more under the sign of the how, right? How are we going to write the essay, use references in the essay, publish essays? All of these things are part of the other workshops. So the what, the why, and the how. Regarding my presentation, first I want to start with a disclaimer. Which is that I do not have actually a background in literary studies. My background is in philosophy, and I say that because sometimes my references come from a slightly different background. I tend to indeed refer more to philosophers than to literary authors in the tradition of the personal essay. But I think that is actually quite interesting in itself, right? As we have regularly noted also in our group, that we have these kind of common reference points, such as obviously Montaigne, but then these also go into different directions, and you have indeed more the tradition of the philosophical essay with figures like Roland Barthes or Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and then you have the more personal essay with Virginia Woolf and so forth. And these do not always come together. And I think part of the appeal, at least to me, in this project has been to bring these traditions together. So what I would like to do in talking about the function of the essay and the why of the essay is actually start indeed with a philosophical reference and do a little bit of reading, so a kind of reading exercise together. I am going to start in a minute with quite a lengthy quote. I hope that you bear with me, but I guess thinking about the essay, learning to write essays, also about a lot of reading essays. And the quote that I want to share is by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. And David Hume, actually in his own time, wasn't so famous as a philosopher, but more as primarily a historian, but also as an essayist. And part of that had to do with the fact that his, what he considered himself to be his most important philosophical contribution, namely the Treatise of Human Nature, that it was a kind of commercial flop. He himself once said that it fell dead-born from the press. So no one really took notice of it. And almost to make a kind of virtue of necessity, he started writing essays. And these were later published, essays, moral, political, and literary. And these were actually quite successful and were read a lot. And I want to quote from the preface to this collection, which was actually unpublished, which is titled Of Essay Writing, which is indeed, again, one of those examples of an essay about the essay, a meta-essay. So let's start reading Hume. So he starts in the following way. The elegant part of mankind, who are not immersed in the animal life, but employ themselves in the operations of the mind, may be divided into the learned and the conversable. The learned are such as have chosen for their portion the higher and more difficult operations of the mind, which require leisure and solitude and cannot be brought to perfection without long preparation and severe labor. The conversable world, joined to a sociable disposition and a taste of pleasure, an inclination to the easier and more gentle exercises of the understanding, to obvious reflections on human affairs and the duties of common life, and to the observation of the blemishes or perfections of the particular objects that surround them. Such subjects of thought furnish not sufficient employment in solitude, but require the company and conversation of our fellow creatures to render them a proper exercise for the mind. And this brings mankind together in society, where everyone displays his thoughts and observations in the best manner he is able, and mutually gives and receives information as well as pleasures. The separation of the learned from the conversable world seems to have been the great defect of the last age, and he's now primarily talking about the Middle Ages, and must have had a very bad influence both on books and company. For what possibility is there of finding topics of conversation fit for the entertainment of rational creatures without having recourse sometimes to history, poetry, politics, and the more obvious principles, at least of philosophy? Must our whole discourse be a continuous series of gossiping stories and idle remarks? Must the mind never rise higher, but be perpetually stunned and worn out with endless chat of Will did this and Nan said that? This would be to render the time spent in company the most unentertaining, as well as the most unprofitable part of our lives. And then he continues. On the other hand, learning has been as great a loser by being shut up in colleges and cells and secluded from the world and good company. By that means, everything of what we call belles lettres become totally barbarous, being cultivated by men without any taste of life or manners, and without that liberty and facility of thought and expression which can only be acquired by conversation. Even philosophy went to wreck by this moping recluse method of study, and became as chimerical in her conclusions as she was unintelligible in her style and manner of delivery. And indeed, what could be expected from men who never consulted experience in any of their reasonings, or who never searched for that experience where alone it is to be found, in common life and conversation? 'Tis with great pleasure I observe that men of letters in this age have lost, in a great measure, that shyness and bashfulness of temper which kept them at a distance from mankind, and at the same time that men of the world are proud of borrowing from books their most agreeable topics of conversation. 'Tis to be hoped that this league betwixt the learned and conversable worlds, which is so happily begun, will be farther improved to their mutual advantage. And to that end, I know nothing more advantageous than such essays as these with which I endeavor to entertain the public. In this view, I cannot but consider myself as a kind of resident or ambassador from the dominions of learning to those of conversation, and shall think it my constant duty to promote a good correspondence betwixt these two states, which have so great a dependence on each other. I shall give intelligence to the learned of whatever passes in company, and shall endeavor to import into company whatever commodities I find in my native country proper for their use and entertainment. The balance of trade we need not be jealous of, nor will there be any difficulty to preserve it on both sides. The materials of this commerce must chiefly be furnished by conversation and common life. The manufacturing of them alone belongs to learning. So, lengthy quote, as I said, about what the essay is, but more importantly, what the function of the essay is. And I would actually immediately start with a very short discussion round. So, speak to the person next to you, or persons, only in a few minutes, and reflect on what is Hume actually saying here about the function of the essay. Is it something that you agree with? And do you see this indeed as the role of the essay, or do you think that there's a other or a different or a more important role of the essay? And to what extent does Hume's what Hume says apply to the current situation of the essay in particular, of course? So only a few minutes, discuss amongst oneself, and then I'm curious what you come up with. Sorry? Yes. I think in today's editions it is included, but as a kind of appendix. Actually, I don't know why he didn't include it, because it is a really nice text. It is a bit of a weird text, because I think the first half is indeed mostly what I quoted from, and then there's a second half which is rather misogynistic in terms of why women aren't capable of these kinds of...
As a definition, it is sort of didactic, right? You learn, go down to the level
Precisely,
of people who need... So it's a very different dynamic, and as you said, there's a very different entry point to the idea of the person, which stems from prioritizing even common and the ordinary and the humble.
Yeah. No, I'm actually curious whether they will get that out, because you are right that it is. It's on the one hand, it's democratic in the sense that everyone needs to take part in this common conversation, but it's also still vertical in the sense that the learner must busy into it.
So this is a nice context. I have to look it up.
Yeah, that was also what I wanted to do, to make it a bit interactive from the get-go.
Especially tomorrow, if you have almost 11 hours here tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we need these moments where it's become very...
Okay. I would like to continue. There will be plenty of opportunity later to continue conversations. This was more like a kind of a starter, appetizer. So I'm actually curious to hear some of your reflections. So who would like to say something about Hume's quote on the essay, about the function of the essay in general? Yeah, Marcel? Yeah, sure. Wait for the microphone a bit.
Testing.
Yeah?
Yeah, so we agreed that Hume is right on many counts, but it really depends on the topic and the situation, to what extent you are conversible and to what extent you take a position and take some distance and try to have a bird's eye view on the situation. I began by saying that I find the text a bit demagogue because it kind of provokes the learned. And I think this was really necessary in that age when they were revolting against scholasticism.
Yeah.
But today, I think sometimes we need to take a step back and be more learned than conversible. I think I'll say some provocative things throughout the event, because partly because I'm from Hungary and the political situation is hypercharged because the elections are this week. So I'll be a bit polemical, but we agreed with Adrian that in certain political situations, Hungary is a perfect example right now, you have to let go of the banality and take a firm moral stance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's also someone in the back who wants to say something.
Hi, name's Christian from Slovenia. So what Julia and I discussed is that we found that Hume was writing about an essay as a medium for knowledge, for transfer of knowledge between the learned and the conversible, in a way that the learned, who are people of solitude, do not have to mingle or convey in social interactions beyond their capability. And In that sense, we found Hume's perspective on essay as a medium of knowledge. And for today's situation, it can apply in a way that we do not have the learned, maybe the group of the learned, like socially isolated experts is smaller than it used to be, maybe. But the overall knowledge of the world has become wider and more specialized. And in a way, I remember we had in Slovenia a great essayist, Alojz Ihan. He's unfortunately recently deceased. And he was a doctor and a researcher, immunologist. He had a very thorough knowledge. And his essays were the way to convey that knowledge in part to a wider community who does not have the insight in the particular knowledge he had. Mm-hmm. And that was his way to convey some of the knowledge he had to a wider community.
Okay, thank you. One more here in the front. Sorry to keep you walking, Roberta. Just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
My colleague and I came up with the idea that a learned person is the ambassador that transfers knowledge through a recent or an everyday event to the people who don't have so much background knowledge. For example, historical knowledge or civil rights knowledge. And the case in point is the essays that are published in the Times of Malta on topics, on the everyday topics. So usually political issues, foreign policies like the genocide and these laws that are being enacted, like, for example, the law on the execution of Palestinian prisoners, and the background information to that, and the legal rights of these prisoners, or the breaking of these abolition of these legal rights. And so the reader who is not usually, who may not have so much background knowledge will understand the situation better and will be able to form an informed opinion, yeah. Which I think is what Hume here was talking about, between the learned and the conversationalists. Yeah. So the conversationalists are the readers, and the learned is the person who writes the essay in the newspaper. Yeah. The essay in the newspaper. Yeah. I think that is my point, our point.
No, thanks a lot. I will continue, but we will undoubtedly come back to some of these issues. I think these are already very valuable contributions, and they connect actually to something that Mario and I were also just discussing, that there's a kind of tension in Hume's quote, where on the one hand, he describes a kind of democratic ideal, right? In the sense that everyone needs to join this conversation and everyone can be enriched by the knowledge that is produced. Whereas on the other hand, Mario also noted that what Hume is saying is still didactic, so there's also a kind of verticality that he's describing of the learned person needed to transfer his knowledge to the conversable world. Now, we could add to that, and I think this is very present in what you were just saying, that of course Hume is talking about the learned world indeed as academics or the world of intellectual knowledge. But you could perhaps expand this idea of the learned world to knowledge or experiences in a particular domain, right? Which can also be lived experience, of which some people have knowledge that others do not, and that this can also be shared and enrich the overall conversation. This brings me actually to the next part of my introduction, which again deals with a philosopher, a towering figure, you could say, of 20th century philosophy, recently also passed away, Jürgen Habermas. Now, Jürgen Habermas, I wouldn't call him a brilliant essayist, in the sense that at least I do not think he is the best stylist. But he is, I think, a very important intellectual and a very important, sorry? He died recently, indeed, yeah. And what I have always considered to be his most important philosophical work was actually his first book, which is perhaps also a bit sad that your first book is also the best one. I'm not sure whether everyone agrees, but this is the book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. So this was published in Germany in the early 1960s, and it underwent a kind of revival in the late 1970s when it was translated into English. And in this book, Habermas introduces the notion of the public sphere as a realm, both physical and virtual, where people can meet as equals and exchange ideas, ideas about the good, the true, the beautiful, basically about everything. I say physical and virtual because you can think indeed about physical spaces, and Habermas described physical spaces such as the salons, the coffee houses of London, pubs, and where people would meet, these kinds of spaces that would emerge in the 18th century, and where people would discuss all kinds of things. And I add to that also virtual spaces, because this was also the moment that, for instance, the first newspapers would arise, where people would inform each other of the news, of economic developments, but also of literary developments. Now, in Habermas's book, he makes both a kind of historical reconstruction of the public sphere, so it's in part a history of the public sphere, but he also presents the public sphere as a kind of ideal, an ideal where indeed people meet as equals, and where it's not so much your background that is the decisive factor, but rather the strength of your argument, right? So in the salons, for instance, a prince would meet with a merchant and would meet with a captain from the guard and so forth and so on. And they would go into a conversation, and it was not that the prince could say, well, I'm a prince, so I am right. No, it was in argumentation and through deliberation that they would reach a kind of understanding. Because that is indeed also what Habermas is saying, that the public sphere is geared towards mutual understanding and recognition, what Habermas called Verständigung. And this was, in many ways, the birthplace of modern democracies, right? These spaces emerged in a time in which democracies were not instated yet. They rather provided the kind of soil for democracies to emerge. And interestingly, also part of Habermas' reconstruction is what he calls the literary public sphere, and he says that the public sphere in terms of politics and economics actually was preceded by the literary public sphere, where indeed man, often man, of letters would meet and would discuss novels and indeed also essays. So I think what Hume is talking about when he talks about this meeting space of the learned and the conversable world is in many ways the same as the public sphere that Habermas was constructing in his theory of it. Now, Habermas has been criticized a lot also for his theory of the public sphere. There have been many responses from all kinds of directions. And let me just name a few, because I think they are closely connected to the way that we can understand the essay and also the function of the essay. One very important and notable response to Habermas has been by Nancy Fraser, an American feminist and critical theorist, who wrote this seminal article responding to Habermas, in which she accused him of obscuring all kinds of actually existing status differentials and social inequality. So Habermas obviously realizes that people are not de facto equal, but he said that if we, as it were, enter the public sphere, we put these kinds of status differentials between brackets. And in those spaces, indeed, as I just said, the power of the best argument wins. But Nancy Fraser says that this is not only a kind of utopian ideal, but it also obscures the fact that to enter these kinds of spaces in the first place, or the extent to which your speech and your manner of speaking is taken either seriously or not, is very much determined by the way you look, which gender you are, etc., etc. So all these kinds of differentials are continuated, so to say, in the extent to which the public sphere is policed, you could say. And in this article, I cannot go too deeply into it, but if you're interested in it, I can give you the references later. She also introduces the notion of subaltern counter-publics, because Habermas has this kind of ideal of one public sphere where we indeed all meet as equals, but Fraser says that actually there are many different public spheres in the plural, many of which indeed are used by subaltern group, marginalized groups to test their own values, ideas, and so forth. So she talks about, for instance, the history of feminism or the Black movement, where you had reading groups, talking groups, where people would discuss their grievances, their own experiences, before making these accessible to a wider public. And this is what she calls subaltern counter-publics. Now, another kind of blind spot of Habermas's theory, which, for instance, has been noted by Chantal Mouffe, is that Habermas is very much focusing, first of all, on consensus, and so on Verständigung, the kind of end goal of the public sphere, but also on the idea of a rational deliberation. I mentioned earlier that Habermas does recognize that there's also something as the literary public sphere, but it plays a relatively modest role in his theory. So Habermas is very much emphasizing rationality as the kind of core of democratic debate, whereas some more recent scholars of political philosophy, such as Chantal Mouffe, but also someone like Jacques Rancière, they say that there's also something like the aesthetics of politics and the politics of aesthetics, in that sense that also all kinds of artistic, literary expressions can be considered as being part of the public sphere. Now, I think that on both of these accounts and in relation to both of these responses to Habermas's theory of the public sphere, we can recognize the relevance of the essay. And just to illustrate this, I was thinking of the introduction to the collection by James Baldwin, Notes from a Native Son, of a Native Son, where he says the following: one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art. The difficulty then for me of being a Negro writer was the fact that I was, in effect, prohibited from examining my own experience too closely by the tremendous demands and the very real dangers of my social situation. So I think in this quote, both of these blind spots are kind of identified, right, in Habermas's theory. So on the one hand, the idea that democracy revolves not alone around rational deliberation, but also experience and the expression of experience. And secondly, and that is the point, of course, that Fraser was making, that that the borders of the public sphere are also policed in all kinds of ways, and that indeed Baldwin here notes that the extent to which he could examine his own experience was very much policed and very much prohibited, as he explains here. So that is, I think, very much noted by Baldwin. Now, to conclude this part of the introduction, let me just refer once more to Habermas, who a couple of years ago wrote a kind of sequel to structural transformation of the public sphere, titled, well, perhaps not so imaginatively, A New Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, in which he talks about all kinds of developments that are also threatening the contemporary public sphere, and that makes us, or that gives us the kind of necessity to rethink or adjust our understanding of the public sphere. Let me just mention a few very fastly. So first of all, we can of course think of the already for a long time ongoing processes of globalization, because Habermas and the kind of public sphere that he was describing in his 1960s book very much took the nation state for granted, and national languages for granted, and the way in which all kinds of national issues were debated by a national public, and the way that a national public could also kind of form a very powerful force to move governments into a certain direction, right? But in an age of increased globalization, that is becoming actually more and more difficult. Habermas himself has written a lot about Europe, and part of the problem of Europe, Habermas noted, was that Europe is an economic unity, and Europe is to some extent a political unity, but it doesn't have a united public sphere. There is no European public, so to say, that exchanges ideas on that kind of scale, and of course, let alone on a global scale. Now, that is, I think, one of the challenges of the public sphere today, and I think part of our endeavors to develop the notion of the planetary essay also is about that. Now, we can also think of the way that the public sphere becomes increasingly fragmented, right? And different people reading different newspapers, completely different news resources, living in completely different worlds. And the kind of polarization that follows from that, of course, now becomes a huge burden also on all kinds of political scales. And finally, and this is where Habermas's book is also very much about, how do all kinds of new media, social media platforms, for instance, how do they operate within the realm of the public sphere? To what extent can they be considered actually as part of the public sphere, whereas they are obviously also huge, there are huge economic interests in these firms. So to what extent do they actually foster the public sphere? Now, we are not going to discuss all these developments right now. They will be in the background of a lot of discussions, I guess also in the days to come. For now, we have half an hour left for this introduction. And what Mario and I discussed was that we want to give you a kind of assignment in the sense that we want to ask you to reflect on your favorite essay or essayist and think about how some of the things that Mario or I have said about essayism, what it means, or whether you recognize this in your own favorite essay or essayist. We would like you to talk about that in groups of approximately 5 participants. But, as an important kind of side note, out of these 5, only 2 can come from the same institution. So we like you to mingle a little bit. And then we give you 15 to 20 minutes or so to discuss that in your group. And then we have about 10 minutes left to conclude, again, plenary. Mario, did I forget something?
No, you didn't. Feel free to stand up and move around. So the aim is also for you to get to know each other, because you're going to be in workshops where there will be sometimes individual work, sometimes group work. Okay, so groups of 5 or 6. Only 2 should know each other from before. The rest should be unknown people. 15 minutes. Okay, please have a seat. Now, we've got around 10 minutes, because I believe then there's a coffee break. And that's important, of course. So, we're going to have 10 minutes. What we'd like you to do is to perhaps, from each group, I don't think we'll manage to go through all the groups, but if you could appoint one person who could report back some of the things you discussed, that's what we'd love you to do. So the question was, in considering some of your favorite essayists or your favorite essays, do any of the thoughts that we shared with you today resonate with that? What was your discussion about? As you can see, the opening session was meant to open the discussions. Okay. So, would anyone like to give it a go? Anyone would like to share? So, I would expect there to have been discussions, because it's a very mixed group, very eclectic. We'd be curious to see some of the conversations.
We had a fruitful conversation again, but there were a few themes that came up. We talked about the Hungarian situation again. I have a fellow Hungarian here, and this might get boring after a few days. But we talked about the Hungarian tradition of polemicism. And basically 100 years ago there was this very vibrant scene in Hungary, in the big cities. And there was this group of writers who contributed to a newspaper weekly, we think, called Nyugat, which means West. And they were constantly polemicizing against the government, which was just like today, very right-wing and, well, anachronistic, feudalistic, and also against a very bigoted society. And we find inspiration in this movement. And just like today, these writers who wanted to see some change in society, they were targeted. And we don't want to pose as victims, but it's difficult in a very conservative society to polemicize like this. But then again, there is a quite authoritarian government, and we see a sort of moral imperative to speak your mind. And there is a new vibrancy today in Hungary. And then we had another theme, which was ecology. We had an actual natural scientist in the group, and also Adrian said that he's looking into the Anthropocene. So a second theme was that, well, the personal is planetary, I guess, and we're facing global issues like climate change, which will bleed into writing and personal experience. And third, what was your name? Opan talked about reading the essays and liking the ones that provoke him the most, which is an interesting perspective, or the ones he hates the most. And I think that's something to consider too, reading the essay as something that provokes you to think. So these were our themes.
Thank you, Marcel. Anyone else would like to share? That's a great starting point. There's so much which comes to mind, but I'm going to resist because otherwise I'll end up talking, and it's your turn. So would anyone else like to share their conversation? I want to invite you to do so. There's David at the end. Thank you.
So the name's David. We were two from Malta, two from Ghent, and one from the Netherlands. So basically, we didn't come to any particular conclusion from our discussion. We mentioned Annie Dillard's Living Like Weasels essay, Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, Lewis Owen's Burning the Shelter, and I mentioned George Orwell's Such Were the Joys, Shooting an Elephant, and a Hanging, basically. So we tried to connect them because we couldn't help but refer to the personal as public and also as political. So there were two traits that were also mentioned previously in both your discussions. As well as we mentioned the occasional, I forgot the name of the essayist, forgive me. So basically it was about buying a house, which was so occasional and very common nowadays that it could fit well with the essayistic as well. Exactly.
Thank you, David. Anyone else? Thanks for sharing those essays. And one of the things that you will be doing probably at the end of this conference is buy more books. Well, we can't finance that too. That's up to you. So, anyone else? Yes, what's your name, please?
Jack, from Amsterdam, or affiliated with Amsterdam, anyway. We had a really nice chat, so I'll just mention two things that we kind of spoke about. One was your different frameworks, Mario, and how they are so useful descriptively, but maybe, I mean, in an ideal theory kind of sense, right? How many of our favorite essays or essays that kind of would overlap? So whether that was, I think my example was The Heresy from Adorno. I'm thinking about that in relation to the second framework you mentioned, so that was personal experience as knowledge. I mean, that is heretical in a number of senses. And again, we can kind of keep going with that. And I think besides that then was just something on Baldwin from Thijs's part of the talk. Just how much of that still resonates. So I'm a philosopher by training, and so much of that still resonates, I guess, with like modern standpoint theory and epistemic, what you call epistemic injustice. And yeah, I don't know, just thinking about that, again, outside of the essays and like the discourses that have been written there, and especially linking that to a lot of the criticisms written about Habermas in the public sphere. Yeah, just the overlap, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to share their views and discussions? What's your name, please?
Hi, Lucian from Ljubljana. Yeah, we discussed also our favorite essayists, and then my colleague from the Netherlands, I think, he mentioned David Foster Wallace, who is also one of my favorite authors, and then colleague from Italy, she mentioned Virginia Woolf, and then we started to think why we prefer essayists who like really struggled with mental health, or how to say it, and we were guessing maybe this is really like this very natural state of mind all the time, doubting about everything around yourself. So this is, and then we had a discussion about whether you should be like really an expert in the field what to write an essay about, and then yeah, we were like also thinking more or less probably you cannot be an expert in anything. And then I thought of Thomas Bernhard, who is a novelist, not an essayist, but his writing is very essayistic, and he has in one of his characters really thinks about that the things we love the most about Montaigne or Pascal. It's not that they are so great expert in some specific field, but they are like, they show vulnerability, they can be weak, and that this is something that readers or thinkers appreciate the most about great thinkers. So
yeah, I think that resonates a lot. We were saying, Thijs and I, how we have exposed a kind of continuum. So you've got, on the one hand, Montaigne saying that he's an expert in one subject, and that subject is himself, and that gives him the authority to speak. But then you've got David Hume, who speaks about the learner, that's bringing in a certain kind of authority. And what you're saying sort of resonates with that, these different tensions. Maybe a final intervention. Would anyone else like to share with us some of the essays that you mentioned, maybe, or some of the ideas that resonated with you?
Perhaps an essayist
Yeah.
hasn't been mentioned yet, who's someone's favorite and that you discussed.
We've got one final intervention there. What's your name, please?
My name is Shema, and I'm from the University of Groningen. I don't know if people would consider her an essayist, but I would say Gloria Andalthua, who writes in a very essayistic manner. And as you were going through the 13 ways of maybe understanding an essay, she kind of bounces around between all of them, but refuses to conform to any singular one. If you look at her whole body of work, throughout our discussion, we were also kind of looking at maybe the tension between embodied and intuitive ways of knowing as the force behind the essay, and more methodical and, I guess, argument-driven sort of essays.
Great.
My 2 cents.
What comes to mind is how many of these themes that you've mentioned are the subject of workshops, the subject of papers that we know were going to be delivered. So a lot of these motifs will return repeatedly. I would suggest we let them go and have coffee. And we'll be back, I think, in half an hour, right? It's 4:30. We'll try to be punctual. We've got a good half an hour for the next session. Thanks a lot for this. Thank you.